Thank you. So just to say, as we begin this keynote, thank you so much to the University of Winchester for inviting Daniel and I here to open this webinar. The university has played a really pivotal role in our respective trajectories. So we're delighted to be able to open this session. I'd like to start our presentation by focusing on just a few key terms that are really important in understanding the work that we do, and to make sure that everyone within the audience has the same understanding about how we're using certain phrases. So, start with the first definition I would like to give you is how we refer to higher education. Higher education is any education that is post-compulsory. It can range from the provision of like English language qualifications through to doctoral study and fellowships and postdoc opportunities within higher education. The second key definition is sanctuary, which we broadly understand to mean safety and protection. And sanctuary initiatives specific to higher education, as we're discussing today, aim to resist immigration control and create spaces of refuge and welcome for people with unsettled or precarious immigration status. So we use the term people seeking sanctuary as a terminology to describe people who seek safety. It's an umbrella term that transcends immigration status and decisions on immigration status. So it's a more universal way of describing the people we're talking about today. So in respect to this webinar, Daniel and I really, the focus of our discussion today is exploring the relationship between lived experience, practice, and how these two things have shaped theory and conceptual understandings of forced displacement, higher education, and sanctuary. So I have a fairly ambitious plan over the course of the next 45 minutes, but what we're going to start by doing is exploring the origins of both the barriers and resistance to the barriers that have excluded people seeking sanctuary from higher education. We want to follow on from that by reflecting on the progress that's been made to date by universities who, in a growing context of hostility, are able to and willing to show hospitality to people who need sanctuary. We want to conclude by looking to the future and exploring how we can create a shared and connected response to inclusive higher education centered on sanctuary within universities. So, we could move on the slides, Daniel. So if we move on to the next slide, what we'd like to start by doing, before we get into the detail, we'd like to ask a key question. Are you able, as audience members or people engaging with this webinar, to think of a word or phrase that describes what higher education means to you or your experience of it? So assuming that most people have experience of or aspire to access higher education. So Daniel, if I were to ask you this question, what would your phrase or keyword be?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And again, I echo the thanks to join this webinar and to speak to this event. So for me, I would say the word that comes to mind is flourishing. So the opportunity to become the sort of best version of yourself, pursuing aspirations that you have. Because higher education isn't for everyone, but for those who really desire to pursue higher education, it really provides an opportunity for them to flourish whatever discipline they pursue, whatever sort of choice they make in terms of the subject area. It really gives them an opportunity to flourish, and I've seen that in my own case with the paths that I chose, being able to sort of flourish in my sort of subject area. And I've also seen it with other people that I've known before getting into higher education, seeing them flourish when they are in higher ed and continuing to flourish based on the experiences that they had during that time at university or in higher education. So flourishing, I think that's the word for me.
Good word. Good word.
How about you, Rebecca? What's your word?
There are many words, but I think higher education, if I think about what it's personally meant to me or how important it's been to me, is transformation. It's the transformative impact it's had on my life. I've had significant gaps between all of my degrees, but they've all been transformative in terms of the experience, what I've learned, how it's broadened my horizons of the world, the way I see and think about things, and also kind of transformative in terms of the opportunities that all of my higher education experiences have created for me. So yeah, I think higher education for me has been and continues to be transformative. So we hope that everyone in the audience can think about or connect with why higher education is so important to them. I'd like to move on. If we could move on to the next slide. So the first part of our presentation is really exploring how resisting the barriers to higher education. So February 2025 is the 20-year anniversary of when I became involved in working with or concerned with the issue around bordering in higher education. So it wasn't that I became aware of this issue as a problem per se, but the scale or the scope of this issue in the lives of young people I was working with. So for those of you who aren't aware, in the UK context, and this applies to many other contexts, but specific to the UK in this example, people seeking sanctuary are categorized as international students when it comes to higher education. And it means they're denied access to funding. And this has a huge impact on people's lives. Now, this, when I worked with Save the Children as a development officer, I worked with a group of young people, and we gave them an opportunity to identify and deliver an advocacy initiative of their choosing. The group I worked with in Manchester were unequivocally wanted to focus on access to higher education. They had no other issue that was of greater concern to them. They were resolute in the pursuit of this campaign, and it's really important to point out here that this was a collective as opposed to an individual approach to wanting to transform higher education. They wanted anyone to benefit who sought sanctuary in the UK. So I'll hand back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rebecca. And really, I think I've gone one slide too far. Really speaking again, or have I?
That's perfect.
Yeah, with what Rebecca was saying with the Brighter Futures project and people voicing what they want, and of course the change that we've seen in the provisions. Equitable access and high quality student experience are key expectations for many people aspiring to higher education. However, for those seeking sanctuary, what could be a smooth transition in their journey is riddled with complex barriers. So often the experience that people have is hope and ambition quickly turning into feelings of helplessness and despair. Many people who have completed part of their education where they now live find that they cannot progress to higher education like their peers and simply are left behind. So common advice that I've heard, is just to wait until your immigration status changes, which effectively puts people's lives on hold. So some find opportunities through friends or the odd knowledgeable careers advisor or other channels. However, accessing these opportunities requires patience and resilience, as navigating this period of uncertainty can be stressful. This reality is marked with constant anticipation, frequent disappointments, highlighting the disparities in access to higher education. The rights, laws, and pathways vary widely worldwide, and people depend on a patchwork of often inconsistent and unpredictable policies and support systems. In countries, or in some countries, inclusive policies and dedicated scholarships foster a culture of welcome and hope. However, in many places, too many places, restrictive regulations and limited resources prevent individuals from pursuing their educational aspirations. making access to higher education a matter of geographic luck rather than a guaranteed right. So pass back to you, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so to give you an abridged version of the Brighter Futures campaign, which was the group I worked with in Manchester on the initial Access to Higher Education campaign, essentially they developed and implemented a strategic approach in which they excelled as negotiators, persuading vice chancellors to create scholarships to facilitate access to higher education, the earliest iteration of sanctuary scholarships. Crucial to highlight Winchester's role, in particular Terry Sanderson and the then vice chancellor Joy Carter, who were instrumental in terms of Winchester becoming one of the first of 3 universities to promote scholarships. And Joy Carter was instrumental in influencing universities across the cathedral group to offer full tuition fee waivers to students who'd sought sanctuary. And this led to the slow and steady growth of scholarships led by, at the time, the Article 26 project. Between 2008 and 2015, higher education for displaced people was accessible via a modest number of scholarships, 85 scholarships delivered across 17 institutions. Around 2013, there's a process of gradually embedding sanctuary scholarships, which were originally managed externally, to move into kind of internal scholarship schemes existing within universities. So I'll hand back over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So I think that the context, and you can see in the graph, that sort of accelerated lift in terms of the amount of scholarships that are being offered, coming around 2015 to 2016, where we know the crises in the Middle East and North Africa led to this surge in higher education opportunities for people seeking sanctuary. Organizations advocated for inclusive policies, scholarships covering tuition and living expenses, and thus reshaped access to education. So these efforts that you can see sort of represented in this graph are inspiring more institutions to join the cause to create a more inclusive education system that supports sanctuary seekers' potential. Collaborative initiatives like the Displaced Student Opportunities Portal, developed in collaboration with Student Action for Refugees, STAR, the City of Sanctuary, and Refugee Education UK, RE UK, aims to support sanctuary seekers by providing a comprehensive signposting channel where scholarships, bursaries, all kinds of opportunities to access higher education are hosted on one platform. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thank you. So the question is really, how do we connect lived experience and the practice that's been developed through sanctuary scholarships to thinking theoretically about access to higher education? Now, here we can see this is a kind of a theoretical model or a way of conceptually thinking around bordering in higher education. So I developed this idea of the higher education border during my doctoral study, which was a comparative project looking in depth at access and participation in higher education for people with unsettled immigration status across the UK and Sweden. And since my doctorate, I've explored this model in other contexts and thought about it such as Australia and Canada, working with partners and academic colleagues in those countries. So it has been exploring the international resonance of this way of thinking. So the higher education border is essentially, it's not a single or a static border, but it's a collective term used to describe multiple borders and bordering practices that operate at different layers. There are ways in which the border serves to explicitly exclude people by effectively bordering them from accessing higher education. There are more implicit methods relating to implicit methods of excluding people, be it relating to language, bureaucracy, qualifications. And then the final layer is that, all of these bordering practices serve to deter other people who sought sanctuary, perhaps not seeing they have a place or an opportunity to belong within higher education. So in terms of thinking, so the higher education board is very malleable. It can be moulded and shaped according to an individual who's trying to cross the border, essentially. So when we think about how the higher education board is operationalized, it's not a singular experience. The borders are built essentially from actual or perceived deficits in the capital that's held by people who sought sanctuary. So what do people bring with them? And when I talk about capital, I'm talking first of all about their immigration status. Do they have the required immigration status, which will grant them access to economic capital, such as student finance, or even extending from that, employment? Do they have limited access or no access to work to raise the money to pay for tuition fees? Or can they access support from charities, kind of other alternative sources to pay tuition fees and get support in higher education? So moving beyond those, what we might arguably state are the fundamental challenges in terms of immigration status and funding, there are a myriad of other challenges that people encounter crossing the higher education border. Just to touch briefly on a couple of examples, a linguistic capital is another area. Do people have the language skills or resources required to evidence their language skills? Do they have the social and cultural capital? Can they navigate the complex higher education bureaucracy, such as UCAS admissions or student finance regulations? I mean, most people would argue they're quite tricky to navigate, regardless of whether you're seeking sanctuary or not. And what we need to also remember, be very mindful of, is the fact that the higher education border is underpinned by the wide racialization of all migrant groups, which is regardless of kind of phenotypical characteristics, but at the same time important to remember or be mindful of colonial logics and hierarchies and how they're visible in the displacement or responses to displacement by higher education providers. And then all of these factors are further impacted by different intersectional aspects of identity, be it gender, class, disability. So how the higher education border is experienced differently, a very kind of stark example is someone who is actively seeking asylum in the UK. Primarily, the main border for them might be not being able to access student finance, the funding to access higher education. Whereas someone who's a refugee with kind of a permanent right to remain in the UK, with access to student finance, might face or might experience borders in the sense that their previous qualifications haven't been recognised, or they simply can't access the information to navigate the systems and processes to make an application. Okay, I'll hand back over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. So now taking another moment to pause, a reflective question for you to consider in the audience. How do the barriers and borders to higher education resonate with you with the context in which you live, work, and or study? Of course, Rebecca just now mentioned what that looks like in the UK in terms of the differences for those with asylum seeking status and refugee status. And of course, that again will still vary with the different precarious immigration statuses that exist in the UK and what access looks like. So yeah, take a moment to consider what that looks like for your context, because we're very aware with this being an international context that can vary quite widely. Rebecca, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say on this question.
No, just I think it's just trying to. I think what we're trying to do, Daniel, isn't it, is how we can connect experiences or understandings of bordering across different that transcend not only country context but also institutional context in which people experience these barriers. It's trying to identify what we have in common rather than differences, but also where there is commonality in terms of experiences of navigating higher education.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on that point in more detail shortly. So moving on to part 2 of this webinar, where we speak more so of going from access to welcome and reflect on the progress of Sanctuary, reflections on Sanctuary's progress. The idea is people who have gone from initially receiving scholarships, becoming catalysts for change in enhancing access to higher education. So in the pictures there, you'll see different individuals who have received scholarships at some point and are now leading in various organizations. So these sanctuary scholars have not only pursued their own educational ambitions, but have become advocates and leaders within their communities. And they have used their experiences to highlight the barriers faced by sanctuary seekers, advocating for policy reforms and institutional change that promote inclusivity. So the picture at the bottom there is I really love that picture because that's in the middle is the former rector of the University of Edinburgh speaking with a group of people who have experienced displacement in some form and having a conversation. So many people, like my peer, colleague, friend, Miriam Tahir, who studied at the University of York, started volunteering in their Student Action for Refugee Society, helped set up the a national group with STAR so that people with lived experience of seeking sanctuary have some oversight over STAR's campaigns. Miriam is now the Universities of Sanctuary coordinator and is leading the growth of the movement to where there are now around 34 universities of sanctuary and counting. There are many more examples of people who have made the journey from sanctuary scholar to an advocate and are now leading change for the cause. Another example being Aruba Hamid with the HERE project and Jean-Marie Shimwe with the Youth Voices community, now the refugee seat, our seat, who have built refugee-led organizations from Newcastle with Aruba's project to Nairobi with Jean-Marie's project. That impact ranges from advocacy training to coordinating support at asylum hotels, etc. Slide. So back to you, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So at this point, it's important to reflect on, we've seen that there are lots of, we've understood the lived experience in respect to promoting access and welcome. And it's important to pause here and think about those different approaches and what they mean and what we can understand from them. So there are diverse and seemingly disparate practices that have led change, broadly conceptualized as discretionary and rights-based approaches. So thinking about these key challenges about overcoming international student status and ineligibility for student funding, just to give you a sense of how these essentially two different prongs to these approaches. So we think about the Brighter Futures Project and Article 26 and various other organisations such as Student Action for Refugees, We Belong, but lots of organisations that have worked towards scholarships in higher education. This is about persuading universities or lobbying universities to use their discretion to create fully funded scholarships. So this is been transformative across the UK, and we're not in any way minimizing the impact of scholarships, but this approach does allow universities to retain the power to create, deliver, and also dissolve scholarships. They also identify and select beneficiaries. If we look at more rights-based approaches and thinking about We Belong in particular, have had fantastic success in terms of changing socioeconomic rights associated with specific immigration statuses, opening pathways to reclassify beneficiaries of these changes as home students in higher education, and therefore becoming recipients of student funding, which is again phenomenal in terms of and transformative in terms of what that has achieved. But further challenges do lie in the fact that legal categories, especially pertaining to legislation, are often closely bounded, and there are strict criteria pertaining to age, the number of years resident in the UK, or in respect to more recent legislative change in Scotland, are closely bounded by geography. So this is to essentially open up this kind of debate between discretion and rights-based approaches, and what it really does to highlight the challenges of trying to achieve inclusivity and more universal strategies and approaches to opening up higher education. I'll pass back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rebecca. So one thing that we are exploring now is really getting data to evidence what we are seeing in terms of how the higher education border is experienced. And this is, well, one avenue has been the Reimagining the Higher Education Border project. So this project aimed to understand the barriers preventing young people with migration and displacement backgrounds from accessing higher education in the UK. It has utilized a mixed method approach. It had utilized a mixed method approach, combining qualitative and quantitative methods to collect, analyze data on advice and guidance queries from RE UK, Refugee Education UK, and STAR, Student Action for Refugees. So in the graph they've shown, we have records of over 3,000 individuals making inquiries, the majority of which coming from RE UK and some from STAR. And essentially, what you can see is the amount of interest in people making inquiries from different immigration statuses. And again, sort of linking back to what was said a moment before about how various people with different statuses are making requests about access. So essentially, this data collected includes a variety of queries relating to higher education, such as queries about scholarships, admissions processes, financial aid, support services. 42.1% of queries coming from people seeking asylum, 31.6% of people aged 21 to 25, 15% of queries coming from people aged 26 to 30. This reflects the disrupted studies and reinforces the need for lifelong learning approaches. 62% of initial queries related to scholarships, not general info about higher education. So these queries are made by a diverse range of groups, and essentially what we would hope to do with this data is to ensure that our systems are able to meet the need of that diverse diverse population who are seeking access to higher education.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. So this is another opportunity to kind of press pause almost at the end of the second section of the presentation. I think just to ask you really to think about what do you think of how do you perceive the progress to date? I think we're demonstrating two things here really, that there is significant progress and change is possible, but also there's still a lot more work to do. There is still further progress to be made. And can you identify any particular gaps in provision or challenges in the context in which you're working, living, studying? And how do they resonate with the sorts of challenges that we're describing here? Okay, so with that, we will move on to the third part of the presentation, third and concluding part. I'll pass back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rebecca. So as we're progressing, we've sort of developed an understanding of access, welcome, and now sort of in this final part, the idea of protection. And this is really a sort of vision for the future, reimagining the future of sanctuary. So to speak to this, a shared and connected vision for the future, coalitions of students, universities, staff, charities, NGOs, and other relevant parties are vital in addressing the often shifting issues faced by those navigating the higher education system. These coalitions are well positioned to transform higher education. However, the nuances of different global contexts will determine how they need to act within their local systems. So exchanging knowledge about the experiences of accessing higher education, lobbying for change, practicing advocacy in various capacities will facilitate an exploration of possibilities to increase access globally. So linking to the picture, and networks like the Tertiary Refugee Student Network hold a wealth of advocacy and knowledge due to their strong connections with people and organizations working on the ground, connected to local issues, as mentioned before, from Newcastle to Nairobi and beyond. But are also collaborating with and engaging with organizations such as the Global Student Forum. The network that the TRSN facilitates advocacy raised to a global platform so that those on the ground, those sort of, dealing with issues on the ground, are represented on the global stage at forums such as the Global Refugee Forum, the World Access to Higher Education Conference. So in the picture there, it's myself speaking to students at the Student Union in Australia, sharing ideas about how we can effectively seek that target of 15% of refugees being enrolled in higher education by 2030. So further, let me go back one, the Immigration, Displacement and Immobility, the IASFM research cluster, which Rebecca and I are both founding members of, is comprised of an international group of academics, practitioners, advocates working across a diverse range of contexts, countries, including the role of education, or exploring the role of education, responding to the needs and aspirations of people who have experienced forced displacement. One of our aims is to explore strategies of resistance led by forced migrants in countries across the global north and south, which so far have revealed migrant-led enduring commitments to advocacy, building communities of practice and strategic leadership focused not only on creating opportunities in local context, but shaping new ways of influencing national and international contexts. So the picture there just showing the global representation that we have in these sort of communities and classes, people who are advocating both in their local contexts and also on an international stage.
Thank you, Danielle. So this again brings us to, thinking through lived experience and practice and some very impressive examples that Danielle shared in terms of how these conversations are taking place on an international stage. But how do we understand or think about this theoretically, conceptually? What does it mean? And I think, as Danielle described the Reimagining the Higher Education Borders project, it really created an evidence base through which to explore the scale, or start to explore, I should say, it's the beginning, like the scale, scope and significance of access to higher education. And this created a forum to extend our discussions that progress from kind of thinking about this crossing the threshold into higher education to considering, well, what does belonging really look like? What does it look like beyond being grateful you have a scholarship and an opportunity to study, but what does it mean when you can fully participate and belong within an institution? And do sanctuary scholars experience belonging and welcome in higher education? So the Reimagining the Higher Education Border Group started to work in collaboration with Canadian colleagues in order to kind of expand these understandings beyond the UK, thinking much more internationally. We worked with Dr. Tanya Aberman and the S4 Collective, who are also working on access to higher education in Canada for people who are already resident in the country and want to access university who have precarious immigration status. So this is something that's different to the complementary pathways that are commonly associated with Canada and their response to the need to create opportunities in higher education. So in the first section of this presentation, we talked about the higher education border in relation to access. But again, it's really building on this and thinking about borders and bordering practices throughout the university. So a key question really that we've been thinking about and reflecting upon is, does sanctuary mitigate the impact of bordering, or does it reproduce existing and create new forms of bordering? So we've been thinking about this spectrum of sanctuary that can be perceived or as a further bordering, through to sanctuary that can be shaped by a kind of abolitionist principles. So in doing this, we've been talking about different ways in which we can reform and we can change higher education to be more inclusive and to kind of restructure the structures of higher education. So we've been thinking about reformist reform and whether changes that are made potentially make a situation more tolerable in the moment, but ultimately reinforce, expand, and further enhance kind of systems of exclusion. They don't really directly challenge the systems that seek to exclude people seeking sanctuary in the first place. And then building on that by thinking, well, what would abolition look like? What would it look like if we moved beyond making systems more tolerable and actually changing those systems? So that's what we've been conceptualizing in respect to abolition. So the idea of non-reformist reform that seeks to radically change systems through incremental actions that work to eliminate systemic injustice and oppression. So this is what we've been discussing and talking about. And we've been using these three pillars of access, welcome, and protection to help us understand what we need or want sanctuary to look like in higher education. How do we reimagine sanctuary and create this shared vision that is not within the UK but is international? How do we have the language and conceptual thinking and practice that can be shared on a broader scale, on a global scale? So we're looking at a more universal rights-based approach instead of kind of more discretionary access to higher education. And again, this isn't to minimize the transformative impact of the support that's been provided to date, but to kind of share our ideas, our aspirations for a much more inclusive higher education that's based on rights and not kindness. So this is what we're talking about when we think about reimagining higher education through the lens of a kind of abolitionist forms of sanctuary. Okay, I'll pass back over to you, Daniel, to conclude.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. And taking all of that sort of built understanding and capacity, looking ahead, the future of access, welcome, protection in higher education revolves around building links and sharing knowledge across borders, which touches on many of the points we've covered today. But we really want to emphasize that it's from sort of grassroots initiatives, from our context in the UK, being based here, to global organizations. There is a strong emphasis on staying connected to local issues and approaches wherever you are. Grassroots movements have been pivotal in driving change locally, addressing the immediate challenges, and advocating for inclusive policies within their communities. They influence local policies, practices, shaping broader discussions on education access for sanctuary seekers. Looking forward, the vision is one of interconnectedness and collaboration. By strengthening links between grassroots movements, national organizations like STAR, global networks like the TRSN, we amplify voices, share knowledge, and advocate for meaningful change. This approach fosters an inclusive educational environment where sanctuary seekers thrive and contribute to society. So, lastly, one final question, something to take away and to ponder and to maybe act on as well. What commitments or action would you like to undertake to support the inclusion of sanctuary seekers in higher education? Thank you for listening. There are contact details. Please do reach out to us if you have any queries, questions, or anything else to connect with us. We'll be very happy to hear from you. So thank you.
Thank you.